What makes a vote count? Sugar Ray Robinson thought he knew the answer on November 5th, 1968. Show up, present your ID, cast your ballot, participate in American democracy. But when he arrives at Detroit's Precinct 14 polling station to vote for president, election official Margaret Thompson examines his driver's license and declares, "Your ID isn't valid." What happens in the next 6 hours doesn't just protect one man's voting rights, it exposes how American democracy gets rationed by race, not citizenship. The morning had started with promise. Robinson woke at 5:30 a.m. in his Grosse Pointe mansion, the same house he'd fought to purchase 5 years earlier when real estate agents claimed the neighborhood wasn't ready for black families. Now, looking out at the manicured lawn where his children played, he felt the weight of American possibility. Today was Election Day. Today, he would help choose the next president of the United States. Over breakfast, Robinson's wife Millie served him scrambled eggs and coffee while their youngest daughter, Ronnie, now 12, practiced her civics presentation for school. "Daddy," she asked between bites of toast, "will you vote for the man who wants to help colored people?" Robinson paused, considering how to explain the complexity of American politics to his daughter who saw the world in terms of right and wrong, fair and unfair. "I'll vote for the man I believe will be best for all Americans, sweetheart," he said, thinking about Hubert Humphrey's civil rights record versus Richard Nixon's law and order campaign. That's what democracy means. We all get to choose. But even as he spoke those words, Robinson carried the weight of knowing that "we all" remained theoretical in 1968 America. Just 3 months earlier, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago had erupted in violence. Just 5 months before that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. 7 months before that, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis. The America Robinson wanted to believe in, the America he'd spent his fortune and fame trying to help create, seemed to be tearing itself apart. By 7 a.m., Robinson was already at the campaign office of Detroit's Democratic Party, coordinating voter transportation for elderly black citizens who needed rides to polling stations. This had become his Election Day ritual, using his celebrity and resources to ensure that every qualified voter could participate in democracy, regardless of their economic circumstances or physical limitations. "Mr. Robinson," called out Ethel Washington, a 73-year-old woman who'd been cleaning houses for white families for 50 years. "I've been voting since 1952, but my grandsons say things different now. Say they checkin' IDs real careful, especially for folk like us." Robinson knelt beside Mrs. Washington's wheelchair, taking her weathered hands in his. "Mrs. Washington, you've got every right to vote that any other American has. I'll personally drive you to the polling station and make sure they treat you with the respect you deserve." And he did. From 8 a.m. until 2 p.m., Robinson drove carload after carload of elderly black voters to Precinct 14, helping them navigate the paperwork, supporting those who needed assistance walking, ensuring that each person successfully cast their ballot. He watched Mrs. Washington mark her ballot with the careful concentration of someone who remembered when that right was denied to people who looked like her. By the time Robinson parked his Cadillac outside Lincoln Elementary School for his own voting, he felt the satisfaction of a good citizen who'd spent his morning helping others exercise their constitutional rights. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school playground where children's laughter usually filled the air. Today, democracy had transformed this place of learning into a place of civic participation. Precinct 14 operates out of Lincoln Elementary School on Detroit's East Side, a brick building that transforms into democracy's front line every election day. Long tables staffed by poll workers, voting booths arranged in careful rows, ballot boxes that will determine America's next president. Outside, campaign workers wave signs for Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon, believing their candidate represents the future. Inside, poll workers check voter rolls, verify identifications, hand out ballots to citizens exercising the most fundamental right democracy offers. The school building itself tells the story of Detroit's changing demographics. Built in 1923 when the neighborhood was predominantly white, It now serves a community that's 60% Black, 30% white, with growing populations of Latino and Middle Eastern families drawn by automotive industry jobs. The hallways displayed children's artwork celebrating diversity, handprints and different skin tones arranged into American flags, essays about family immigration stories, pictures of community heroes that include both John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X. But the transformation of the school's student body hasn't been matched by changes in the electoral process. The same families who fought to keep Black students out of Lincoln Elementary in the 1950s still control many of the voting procedures that determine who gets to participate in choosing America's leaders. Robinson arrives at 2:30 p.m., having finished lunch with his campaign volunteers after spending the morning driving elderly Black voters to polling stations. 47 years old, former world champion, successful businessman, registered voter who has participated in every election since moving to Detroit. He wears his best navy suit, Italian silk tie, American flag pin on his lapel, voter registration card in his wallet next to his Michigan driver's license. Everything a responsible citizen needs to cast his ballot. The suit was tailored by the same craftsman who made clothes for Detroit's automotive executives. The tie was a gift from Frank Sinatra after they met at a charity event in Las Vegas. The flag pin was presented to him by President Lyndon Johnson at a White House ceremony honoring athletes who contributed to civil rights progress. The voter registration card was issued the day after he bought his house in Grosse Pointe, when he registered to vote in his new precinct with the pride of a man who'd earned his place in America's democracy. Behind the check-in table sits Margaret Thompson, 52 years old, 15 years as precinct election official, expert at managing voting procedures that separate legitimate voters from ineligible attempts to cast ballots. Her job requires careful examination of identification, verification of voter registration, prevention of fraud that could compromise electoral integrity. Thompson grew up in this neighborhood when it was still predominantly white, the daughter of a Ford Motor Company foreman who lost his job during the Depression and never quite recovered his faith in American institutions. She married her high school sweetheart, Harold Thompson, who worked as a supervisor at the Chrysler Jefferson Avenue plant until automation eliminated his position in 1962. They raised 3 children in a modest house 6 blocks from the school, watching their neighborhood change as white families moved to suburbs and Black families moved in from the overcrowded downtown areas. The changes hadn't been easy for the Thompson family. Property values fluctuated as racial demographics shifted. The corner grocery store where Margaret had shopped for 20 years closed when the owner retired and couldn't find a buyer who wanted to serve the changing customer base. The neighborhood association meetings she'd attended for a decade grew contentious as longtime residents debated integration versus preservation of community character. But Margaret Thompson wasn't consciously racist. She considered herself a fair-minded person who treated everyone with equal courtesy. She'd supported the civil rights movement in principle, even if she worried about the pace of change and its effect on her own family's stability. She'd applauded when Robinson moved into Grosse Pointe, seeing his success as proof that America's meritocracy worked for those who earned their achievements. Still, 15 years of serving as election official had taught her to be vigilant about voting irregularities, especially in a precinct where demographic changes created opportunities for confusion about voter registration, address verification, and identification requirements. Her job was to protect electoral integrity, and she took that responsibility seriously. But in 1968 Detroit, electoral integrity often gets interpreted through racial assumptions about voting eligibility that have nothing to do with citizenship status or registration validity. Can you imagine Robinson's confidence walking into that polling station? A successful American citizen expecting to exercise voting rights he's never been denied, ready to participate in democratic process he's always respected. He'd voted in this same precinct for 5 years without incident. In 1964, he'd cast his ballot for Lyndon Johnson with the satisfaction of supporting a president who signed the Civil Rights Act. In 1966, he'd participated in midterm elections, supporting congressional candidates who promised to continue civil rights progress. He'd even served as an election monitor for the NAACP, observing polling procedures to ensure equal treatment for minority voters. Robinson had never experienced voting discrimination personally, Though he'd heard stories from other black citizens about challenges, delays, and bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to discourage democratic participation, he donated money to voter registration drives, supported legal challenges to discriminatory election procedures, and used his celebrity status to encourage black voter turnout. But on this November afternoon, walking into Lincoln Elementary School with the confidence of a man who'd earned his place in American society through talent, hard work, and public service, Robinson expected nothing more complicated than the routine civic act he'd performed dozens of times before. "Good afternoon," Robinson says politely, approaching Thompson's table. "I'm here to vote. Sugar Ray Robinson, registered at 1247 Rosedale Drive." His voice carries the warm authority of someone accustomed to being recognized, respected, and accommodated. Not arrogance, but the natural confidence of a man who's traveled the world as America's boxing ambassador, who's shaken hands with presidents and foreign leaders, who's been celebrated as a symbol of American achievement and opportunity. Thompson checks her voter rolls with practiced efficiency. Walker Robinson, 1247 Rosedale Drive. She finds his name, notes his registration status, confirms his address matches official records. Everything appears legitimate according to standard verification procedures. But something in Thompson's demeanor shifts almost imperceptibly. The celebrity in front of her doesn't match her mental image of the Walker Robinson listed in her voter records. She'd heard the name Sugar Ray Robinson countless times, of course, but she'd never connected it to the legal name in her registration books. The disconnect creates a small seed of uncertainty that begins growing into suspicion. "I'll need to see your identification," Thompson says, following standard protocol that requires photo ID verification before issuing ballots to registered voters. Robinson produces his Michigan driver's license, current and valid, issued 6 months earlier when he renewed his registration. The license shows his photograph, full legal name, Walker Smith Robinson, current address, expiration date 2 years in the future. Standard identification that meets all legal requirements for voting verification. The license photo shows Robinson at 47, his face carrying the confident expression of a man comfortable with cameras after decades of publicity shots. His hair is perfectly styled, his clothing expensive, his expression dignified but approachable. This is the face of American success, the immigrant son who climbed from poverty to prosperity through talent and determination. But Thompson studies the license with unusual intensity, comparing the photograph to the man standing before her, checking the signature against his voter registration, examining the document for any signs of alteration or irregularity. Her scrutiny extends far beyond routine verification, crossing into the territory of suspicion without clear justification. Picture the electoral calculation happening at that check-in table: valid identification from registered voter versus racial suspicions about voting legitimacy that question black citizens' right to participate in democracy. Robinson waits patiently while Thompson conducts her examination, though he begins sensing something unusual in her behavior. Other voters had been processed quickly, with minimal ID scrutiny and immediate ballot issuance. His verification is taking longer, involving more questions, requiring more documentation review than he's experienced in previous elections. "This license shows the name Walker Smith Robinson," Thompson says after several minutes of examination, "but you introduced yourself as Sugar Ray Robinson. The voter registration shows Walker Robinson. There seem to be discrepancies between your various identifications." The name discrepancies create an opportunity for Thompson to question the validity of Robinson's voting eligibility without explicitly citing racial concerns. Name discrepancies become administrative issues that can justify additional verification requirements. "Ma'am," Robinson explains with patient courtesy, "Walker is my legal name, as shown on the driver's license. Sugar Ray is my professional name, used during my boxing career. The voter registration was completed using my legal name, as required by law. All the documents match exactly." His explanation demonstrates understanding of legal requirements and consistency between official documentation. The names aren't discrepant, they're different versions of the same identity, used appropriately in different contexts. But Thompson continues her scrutiny, now examining Robinson's voter registration card with the same intensity she applied to his driver's license. She compares signatures, checks address formatting, reviews registration dates, looking for any justification to delay or complicate his ballot access. Can you feel the weight of American history settling over that elementary school classroom? One citizen exercising constitutional rights, while election officials create obstacles based on suspicions that have nothing to do with voting eligibility. Ma'am, Robinson responds with respectful authority despite growing frustration. I've provided all required identification: driver's license, voter registration, proof of address, everything Michigan law requires for ballot access. What additional verification does Michigan election law require for qualified voters? The question challenges Thompson to cite specific legal authority for her additional verification requirements. Usually, these administrative delays rely on voter ignorance of electoral law and unwillingness to challenge bureaucratic authority. But Robinson knows his rights. He's studied voting procedures, consulted with civil rights attorneys, and prepared for exactly this kind of administrative obstacle that can deny ballot access through bureaucratic delay rather than explicit rejection. Sir, Thompson responds, election officials have discretionary authority to verify voter identity when circumstances raise questions about eligibility. Multiple names, celebrity status, potential for impersonation, these factors justify additional scrutiny to protect electoral integrity. Discretionary authority, potential for impersonation. The administrative language that gives election officials power to apply different standards to different voters based on subjective judgments rather than objective legal requirements. This is where Robinson's patience begins shifting from polite cooperation to determined resistance, where individual voting rights confront institutional discrimination designed to complicate democratic participation for citizens whose presence challenges traditional voting demographics. Ma'am, Robinson says, his voice gaining strength, discretionary authority must be applied according to legal standards, not personal preferences. I'm a registered voter presenting valid identification at my assigned polling station. What specific Michigan election law authorizes additional verification beyond required documentation? The legal challenge puts Thompson in a difficult position. She must either cite specific statutory authority for her additional requirements or acknowledge that her verification demands exceed legal necessity. But before Thompson can respond, the situation becomes more complicated. James Patterson, a white voter whom Robinson recognizes from country club membership, approaches the check-in table. Patterson presents his driver's license, which Thompson examines briefly before immediately issuing his ballot. The entire process takes less than 30 seconds, with no discussion of name variations, celebrity status, or additional verification requirements. The contrast between Patterson's quick processing and Robinson's extended scrutiny makes the discriminatory nature of Thompson's behavior impossible to ignore. Identical documentation produces dramatically different treatment based solely on racial demographics. Can you imagine the frustration building in Robinson's chest, watching white voters receive immediate service while he faces administrative obstacles that have no basis in law or legitimate electoral procedure? Ma'am, Robinson says, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who recognizes injustice and refuses to accept it. Mr. Patterson just received his ballot after presenting identical documentation that I've provided. What additional requirements apply specifically to my voting eligibility that don't apply to other registered voters? The comparison between his treatment and Patterson's treatment forces Thompson to confront the discriminatory nature of her verification procedures. She cannot explain why Robinson requires additional scrutiny while Patterson does not, without acknowledging racial bias. But rather than backing down, Thompson doubles down on her administrative authority. Each voter presents unique circumstances that require individual assessment. Mr. Patterson is a long-time registered voter whose eligibility is well established. Your celebrity status and name variations create circumstances that require additional verification to prevent potential fraud. Long-time registered voter. Well-established eligibility. The suggestions that Robinson's 5 years of voting in the precinct don't establish his legitimacy the way Patterson's longer residence does. This is where the confrontation escalates from administrative inconvenience to constitutional crisis, where individual voting rights meet institutional discrimination disguised as electoral protection. "Ma'am," Robinson responds with quiet authority that commands attention throughout the polling station, "I've been a registered voter in this precinct for 5 years. I've voted in every election without incident. I've presented all required identification. If you continue to deny my ballot access without citing specific legal authority, you're violating my constitutional right to vote." The mention of constitutional rights transforms the situation from administrative dispute to legal confrontation. Other voters in line begin paying attention. Poll workers at adjacent tables stop their activities. The entire polling station focuses on this conflict over fundamental democratic participation. Thompson realizes she's created a situation that could attract legal scrutiny, media attention, and official investigation. But she's gone too far to retreat without losing face in front of her colleagues and the voters witnessing the confrontation. "Sir," she says with bureaucratic authority that masks her growing uncertainty, "I have the responsibility to ensure electoral integrity. Your documentation requires additional verification through the county election office before I can issue a ballot." County election office. Additional verification. The administrative barriers that can delay ballot access until polling stations close, effectively denying voting rights through bureaucratic procedure rather than explicit rejection. But then something unexpected happens that changes the entire electoral confrontation. Detroit election supervisor James Mitchell enters the polling station during his routine precinct inspection tour, having heard raised voices while checking voting procedures at adjacent schools. He recognizes Robinson immediately and understands the seriousness of any voting rights dispute involving a prominent civil rights figure. Mitchell also recognizes the legal implications of denying ballot access to qualified voters without specific statutory authority. As senior election official, he knows that discriminatory voting procedures violate federal law and can result in Justice Department intervention. "Is there a problem here?" Mitchell asks with official authority that transcends precinct-level administrative decisions. His presence immediately shifts the power dynamic from local bureaucratic conflict to official electoral oversight. Mitchell has authority to override precinct decisions, investigate voting irregularities, and ensure compliance with state and federal election law. "Mr. Robinson's identification requires additional verification," Thompson explains, trying to maintain her administrative position despite the arrival of her supervisor. Multiple names and celebrity status create circumstances that justify additional scrutiny. Mitchell examines Robinson's driver's license and voter registration with professional expertise in electoral law and identification requirements. His review focuses on legal compliance rather than administrative preferences. Can you imagine the relief Robinson feels when a senior election official who understands voting law examines his documentation with actual legal knowledge rather than racial assumptions? "Mr. Robinson," Mitchell says after thorough but efficient examination, "your identification meets all Michigan requirements for voter verification. Driver's license matches voter registration, address is current, documentation is valid. There are no legal grounds for denying ballot access." The professional verification from senior election official eliminates Thompson's administrative objections through proper interpretation of voting law rather than discriminatory application of electoral procedures. But Mitchell's intervention goes beyond resolving Robinson's individual case. He uses this incident to address broader patterns of discriminatory voting procedures that have been reported at multiple Detroit polling stations. "Mrs. Thompson," Mitchell continues with supervisory authority that establishes clear electoral standards, "voter identification verification must be applied consistently according to legal requirements, not individual administrative preferences. Mr. Robinson's documentation is exemplary. Any voter presenting equivalent identification should receive immediate ballot access." The professional correction establishes legal rather than discretionary criteria for voting verification procedures, ensuring equal treatment for all qualified voters regardless of demographic characteristics. Mitchell personally supervises Robinson's ballot issuance, ensuring no further administrative obstacles prevent his democratic participation. The ballot contains choices for President, U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, state legislature, county offices, and local positions. Robinson enters the voting booth carrying the weight of constitutional history. His ballot represents not just personal political preferences, but the culmination of centuries of struggle for democratic participation by people whose ancestors were denied citizenship, whose parents faced legal barriers to voting, whose communities continue fighting for equal electoral access. He marks his choice for president carefully. Hubert Humphrey, whose civil rights record and commitment to social justice aligned with Robinson's vision for America's future. He votes for congressional candidates who support voting rights legislation, state representatives who favor fair housing laws, local officials who promise equal treatment for all citizens. The actual voting process takes 15 minutes, but the experience represents a lifetime of believing in American democracy despite its failures, supporting constitutional principles despite their imperfect implementation, maintaining faith in democratic institutions despite their resistance to change. When Robinson emerges from the voting booth, ballot in hand, ready to deposit it in the ballot box that will help determine America's political future, he feels the satisfaction of constitutional rights exercised despite institutional obstacles designed to prevent his participation. Mitchell uses the incident to initiate comprehensive review of Detroit's polling procedures, implementing new training requirements for poll workers and establishing clear standards for identification verification. Federal voting rights enforcement increases after Robinson's case demonstrates discriminatory ID verification procedures violate constitutional voting guarantees. The psychological impact proves significant when Robinson's successful challenge demonstrates electoral discrimination can be overcome through persistence and legal knowledge. But the story doesn't end with Robinson's successful vote. The real impact unfolds over the following weeks and months as his experience catalyzes broader changes in voting procedures and electoral protection. Robinson understood something powerful during those 6 hours at Precinct 14. Sometimes the most important fights aren't in boxing rings or business offices. They're at polling stations where democracy gets tested by citizens demanding equal access to constitutional rights that define American citizenship. The victory wasn't just about casting one ballot in one election. It was about proving that American democracy requires equal voting access for all qualified citizens when electoral procedures prioritize constitutional rights over administrative discrimination that threatens democratic participation for all qualified citizens equally under the Constitution. Robinson produces his Michigan driver's license, current and valid, issued 6 months earlier when he renewed his registration. The license shows his photograph, full legal name, current address, expiration date 2 years in the future. Standard identification that meets all legal requirements for voting verification. Thompson examines the license with unusual thoroughness, studying the photograph, comparing it to Robinson's face, checking the address against voter rolls, looking for discrepancies that might indicate fraudulent documentation. Picture the electoral calculation happening at that check-in table. Valid identification from registered voter versus racial suspicions about voting legitimacy that question Black citizens' right to participate in democracy. This license appears altered, Thompson says after several minutes of examination. The photograph doesn't match the name, and the address seems inconsistent with our records. Appears altered, photograph doesn't match. The suggestions that Robinson's valid ID represents fraudulent attempt to vote illegally. What Thompson doesn't realize is that she's not just checking voter eligibility. She's gatekeeping access to democracy based on racial assumptions about Black voting rights that contradict legal standards for electoral participation. "Ma'am," Robinson responds with patient dignity, "that's my current Michigan driver's license, issued by the State Department of Motor Vehicles, with my legal name, current address, and valid photograph. What specific alterations do you see?" The question forces Thompson to articulate concerns based on suspicion rather than evidence. Usually, Black voters faced with ID challenges simply leave rather than demanding explicit justification for voting denial. But Robinson isn't leaving. He's forcing explicit confrontation with voting restrictions designed to operate through implication rather than legal justification. "Ma'am," Robinson explains calmly, "Walker is my legal name. Sugar Ray is my professional name. The voter registration was completed using my legal name as required by law. The license matches the registration exactly. What fraud do you suspect?" The explanation should resolve any legitimate concerns about name consistency between identification and voter registration. But Thompson continues raising obstacles based on electoral policies rather than legal requirements. Can you feel the Democratic weight settling over that polling station? One citizen demanding voting rights, while election officials debate administrative technicalities instead of processing legitimate ballots. "Mr. Robinson, voting procedures require absolute certainty about voter identity. Any discrepancy in documentation creates potential for electoral fraud that compromises voting integrity for all citizens." Electoral fraud, voting integrity, the language that makes voter suppression sound like electoral protection rather than democratic exclusion. This is where Robinson's patience shifts from polite cooperation to moral authority, where individual voting rights meet institutional barriers designed to limit democratic participation based on race rather than citizenship. "Ma'am," Robinson says, his voice gaining strength, "I've presented valid identification matching my voter registration exactly. I'm a registered voter at this precinct, a tax-paying citizen, a participant in every election since moving to Detroit. What additional requirements must I meet to exercise my constitutional right to vote?" The question echoes through the polling station like a constitutional challenge. Other voters waiting in line begin paying attention. Poll workers at adjacent tables stop their conversations. Everyone senses confrontation developing over fundamental voting rights. But then, something unexpected happens that changes the entire electoral crisis. Detroit election supervisor James Mitchell enters the polling station during his routine precinct inspection, having heard raised voices while checking voting procedures. 45 years old, 20 years managing Detroit elections, committed to ensuring voting access for all qualified citizens, regardless of demographic considerations. "Is there a problem here?" Mitchell asks with official authority that transcends individual precinct policies. Mr. Robinson's identification appears questionable. There are name discrepancies and documentation concerns that require additional verification before we can issue a ballot. Mitchell examines Robinson's driver's license and voter registration with professional expertise in electoral law and identification requirements. Can you imagine the relief Robinson feels when a senior election official reviews his documentation with actual legal knowledge rather than racial assumptions? "Mr. Robinson," Mitchell says after careful examination, "your identification meets all legal requirements for voting verification. Driver's license matches voter registration, address is current, documentation is valid. There are no legitimate grounds for denying ballot access."
The professional verification from senior election official eliminates Thompson's administrative objections based on proper interpretation of voting law rather than discriminatory application of electoral procedures. But Mitchell isn't finished establishing voting rights over precinct-level barriers. Mrs. Thompson, he continues with barely concealed criticism, voter identification verification requires reasonable examination, not extraordinary scrutiny that creates barriers for qualified citizens. Mr. Robinson's documentation exceeds normal standards for ballot eligibility. The professional correction establishes legal rather than discriminatory criteria for voting verification procedures. The ballot issuance proceeds immediately, with Mitchell personally supervising Robinson's voting process to ensure no further obstacles prevent democratic participation by qualified citizen. Robinson enters the voting booth, reviews candidates for president, Congress, state offices, local positions. He casts his ballot for Hubert Humphrey, believing the Democratic candidate represents better policies for civil rights and economic opportunity. The voting process takes 10 minutes, but the confrontation over voting rights reverberates through Detroit's election system for months afterwards. Mitchell files formal report about discriminatory ID verification that violated voting rights laws and election procedures. His documentation creates official record of voter suppression attempts at Precinct 14. Robinson proved democracy belongs to all qualified citizens when officials choose law over discrimination.